The Cold War. The Cold War was a time of fear for the Americans. The Red Scare consumed the nation due to a series of Soviet Union influence in Europe, Asia, and Africa. During this time, America's policy was containment, with the main goal of keeping communism from spreading to other areas of the world. McCarthyism was the fear of communism, lots of people accused of being spies. Although it was not used until the 1930s, collective security was a plan for maintaining peace throughout an organization of independent states. With this, members pledged themselves to defend each other in the event of an attack. Massive retaliation was a military doctrine and nuclear strategy in which a state commits itself to relate in a much greater force during an attack. This term was coined by Eisenhower's Secretary of State, John Dulles, after Hiroshima and Nagasaki attacks when the USSR developed their own atomic bombs. However, this policy was abandoned by JFK during the Cuban Missile Crisis. Brinkmanship was a term coined during the Cold War to describe the tact of seeming to approach the verge of war in order to persuade one's opposition to retreat. This happened when both sides retreated to damage one another with atomic bombs. The term détente was used as a reference to the general easing of geopolitical tensions between the USSR and the US. This was unfreezing a period in the Cold War and was used by Richard Nixon and Gerald Ford. The Marshall Plan was a European recovery program by Truman's administration which worked towards rebuilding Europe after World War II. This was advocated by George C. Marshall. The Berlin Airlift was when the U.S. supplied food and fuel to the citizens of West Berlin when the Russians closed off land access to Berlin. This furthered the tensions between the Soviets and Americans. The Iron Curtain was an idea of national barrier dividing Berlin into East and West. It prevented the passage of information or ideas between the political entities. The Truman Doctrine was the principle that the U.S. should give support to countries or people that are threatened by the Soviet forces or communism. This caused the U.S. to aid Turkey and Greece and was seen by the communists as an open declaration of the Cold War. Leviatans and beatniks were riders against conformity, while Leviatans were houses made just alike after the war, early suburbs.
Truman did not ask Congress for a formal declaration of war as required by the Constitution. Truman ordered American troops who were stationed in Japan to move to South Korea. As fresh supplies and troops arrived from Japan, soldiers from other UN countries joined the Americans and South Korean forces. On November 25, 1950, 300,000 Chinese troops attacked South Korea and U.S. positions. The U.S. confronted a major land war in Asia. MacArthur favored an invasion of China and distrusted Truman's policy of a limited war to achieve only specific goals. MacArthur favored total victory. He sent a letter to the House Republican leader attacking the president's policies. Truman fired MacArthur for insubordination when the letter became public. The U-2 incident was during the Eisenhower administration. The U.S. U-2 spy plane was shot down in Soviet airspace. The U.S. government tried to keep the plane's mission secret, and this fueled the Cold War. The Soviet Union launched a 184-pound steel ball containing a small transmitter into orbit. They named the satellite Sputnik 1. The following month, they launched a bigger satellite carrying a dog to see how living things reacted to life in space. These launches shocked the Americans, who wondered if the Soviet Union would have the rocket power to launch missiles into American cities. This led to Congress passing the National Defense Education Act, a $1 billion program intended to produce more scientists and teachers of science. In addition, Congress created NASA to coordinate the space-related efforts of American scientists and the military. April 17, 1961, the Eisenhower administration authorized the CIA to plan an invasion an invasion of Cuba to overthrow Fidel Castro. After Eisenhower left office, President Kennedy still decided to implement the plan. The invasion was badly mismanaged with poorly equipped forces and little protective cover. Not only was the Bay of Pigs invasion a failure, but it probably strengthened Castro's position in Cuba. Kennedy took personal responsibility for the failed invasion. In August and September of 1962, U.S. intelligence discovered the Soviets were building nuclear missile sites in Cuba. Major East Coast cities and the Panama Canal would be in range of the missiles. Kennedy approved a naval blockade of Cuba to prevent the Soviet Union from completing the bases. After 6 days, Khrushchev agreed to honor the blockade and remove the missiles. This crisis led to a hotline telephone system between Moscow and Washington, D.C.
The Tonkin Gulf Resolution took place in 1964 after President Johnson requested Congress to allow him to authorize force to defend Americans during the war. This resolution gave him an immense amount of war powers with the order of all means necessary. With this, Johnson sent U.S. troops to South Vietnam to fight against Northern Vietnam all on his own. The NY Times versus United States was a Supreme Court case that further expanded press rights and allowed the NY Times to publish the Pentagon Papers. These papers revealed the lies that Nixon told to the people and played a role in taking him down. The 26th Amendment was passed in 1971 to give the right to vote to people 18 and older. This was pushed for since the draft age for the war was 18, and some fighting didn't even have a say in what they were fighting for. The War Powers Act was passed in 1973 after the Vietnam War made Americans lose trust in their leaders and the power they had. This act restricted the president's ability to make war-related decisions without first consulting with Congress within 48 hours. This was done with the intentions of stopping the growth of imperial presidency. The ping-pong diplomacy occurred in April of 1971 after China invited an American ping-pong team to play against their own team. What seems to be a simple table tennis game was actually a representation for China's willingness to talk, marking a turn of events in America's and China's relations to peace. During the Cold War, the arms race between the Soviets and the U.S. started getting out of hand, consequently resulting in attempts for arms control. In October of 1963, Kennedy signed the Nuclear Test Ban Treaty, which made testing nuclear weapons illegal in all places except underground. The ABM Treaty was then signed, which set limitations of the anti-ballistic missile for the U.S. and Soviet Union. Next came the Strategic Arms Limitation Treaty, otherwise known as SALT I, which froze the deployment of intercontinental ballistic missiles and put limits on anti-ballistic missiles. Although this did not completely end the arms race, it led to SALT II, which limited strategic offensive arms for the Soviet Union and the U.S.